Have you ever wanted to send an email with Python, but weren't sure where to begin? With so many available options, it can be difficult to know which to choose from. Maybe you're looking to send automated emails for some time-consuming process at work, or maybe you want to send confirmation emails to users when they create an account. Whatever the reason, Python is an excellent choice for the task. This is the first of 3 videos where I'll walk you through sending email using Python so you can decide to use the method that's best for you. In each video, I'll walk you through the setup, then we'll code a hello world example, and finally, we'll code a real world example that I've actually used in my career in banking using publicly available information from the United States Federal Reserve. In this video, we're going to use the Sendgrid API. So let's get going. Already have an account, go ahead and create one at www.sendgrid.com. When you're on the console homepage after you've created your account, over here on the left-hand side, you're going to notice an enormous amount of functionality because there's a lot you can do with Sendgrid. But I'm going to keep this really simple. We just want to be able to send an email with a Python script using the Sendgrid API. There's a couple steps we need to do to get started here. We need to create a single sender. There's actually 2 ways to create your sender identity. You can either create a single sender or you can authenticate a domain instead. Authenticating a domain is a little bit more complicated. We're not going to go through that, so I am just going to click on create a single sender here. So I'm going to call this Kaufman Analytics. From email address, we'll say it's Ryan at kaufmananalytics.com. And then the reply to is the email address that the recipient will reply to if we wanted to go somewhere other than where it came from. But in this case, these are going to match. And then I'm going to put in my address here. And city, state, zip code, United States. Nickname, we're going to call this, I don't know, we'll call it KA, Kaufman Analytics. Click Create. It's a little farther down here. Create. Then the sender has been created. So to verify the sender identity, we need to check our inbox, in this case, Ryan at kaufmananalytics.com. And we'll need to confirm that I do in fact own this email address. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Now I'm set up with sender authentication. The next thing that I want to do is set up my API keys. Once I have that, then we can write a little bit of code. So over here on the left-hand side of the screen, in Settings, there's a place called API keys. So you'll want to go there and set up an API key if you do not already have one. So on the right-hand side of the screen here, there's a place called Create API Key. Click that. And then we're going to need to give our API key a name, test API key. And then you have to determine what level of access you'd like to provide your API key, whether it's full access, restricted access, or just access to see billing. So I'm going to click Create and View. So that will create an API key for you. This is the only time that they'll show you the API key. So if you don't catch this now, then it's virtually worthless. And as I always say, never, ever, 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 ever share your API key with anybody, because otherwise you'd be giving them full access, programmatic access to your account, and you'll be liable for any charges or anything that comes from that. So never share your API key. All right, let's get to the fun stuff. Now that we have created a Sendgrid account, we've created a sender identity within Sendgrid, we've created our API key, and we have pip installed our software development kit, pip install Sendgrid, we are ready to do the fun stuff, to write some code. So let's get to that. We are going to want to do our import statements here. From Sendgrid, import API client from Sendgrid dot helpers dot mail import mail. After our import statements, next thing we want to do is create a message object. So we can define our variable here. We can say message equals mail, and then we're going to pass in our from email, our to email, the subject of the email, as well as the body of the email. So those 4 pieces need to be defined here, and we'll say from email Ryan at kaufmananalytic.com, comma, 2 emails equals, we'll use the same address again, Ryan at kaufmananalytics.com, comma, subject equals, we'll just say, I love sending email with Python and Sendgrid. That will be the subject of our email, and then for the body, we'll write it in HTML. So this is the simplest possible example of HTML here, and we'll say HTML content equals, and then we'll do this in bold. So strong, this is my simple HTML body. All right, there's our message object. And then next we need to create a client. So we'll say SG equals Sendgrid API client. And this will take in 1 argument, the API key that we just created a second ago. Next, we'll create our response. And that will be the client, or SG dot send. And then we'll pass in all of the variables that we put into our message object up here. So SG client dot send, pass in message. And then let's just print the response dot status code. If you're wondering what the response is basically just the information that is coming back from Sendgrid to us after we send our email. Pretty straightforward. Response.status code, and then response dot body, and I don't really want to get anything else. So that's it, just a few lines of code here. Now it's telling me I have an error, EOL, end of line, while scanning string literal. My error here is because I do not have closing piece there. And I used a minus sign instead of an equal sign here. That should eliminate all of our errors. Now let's execute this code. All right, that took a few seconds, but we return the status code over here. So it is providing us a 202. So let's go check our email and make sure that that worked. And it did. We have an email from Ryan at kaufmananalytics.com via sendgrid.net. And the subject of the email is I love sending email with Python and Sendgrid, and this is my simple HTML body. And it is bolded, which we did when we did strong. So it looks good. One thing you'll notice is that with Sendgrid, you usually get these this message that says this may be a spoof message because it's coming from my Ryan Kaufman Analytics and it's going to my Kaufman Analytics. So Sendgrid has pretty sophisticated AI to determine whether or not a message may be spoofed. In this case, I know this is real, so I'm just going to click on Look Safe. So that's the basic mechanics of how we send an email with Python and Sendgrid. Let's take a look at a slightly more complicated example that I've actually used in my career in banking. Banks live and die on interest rates. Or more specifically, it's the difference between the interest rate they pay for deposits and the interest rate they receive on the loans that they make. That difference is called a spread, or what's called interest rate revenue. So how do banks know what to charge? Well, it turns out it's a really complex equation that's quite a bit beyond the scope of this video. But the most important rate that's out there is called the effective Fed funds rate from the United States Federal Reserve. So what we want to do is write some code that will extract that rate on a daily basis from the Federal Reserve and put it into an email and send that out. So we can take the core that we've written here and add a bit to this and modify it a bit. So let's also import our datetime module, and then let's import requests, and then let's determine what date it is. So we'll say now is equal to datetime dot now, and then let's format this into a string. This will be useful later on when we go to send our email. So we'll say now dot strft time. If you're not familiar with what strf time is, it's a string from time. It's, in other words, it's a way to kick out a time string from a date time. We'll say %y, %m, and %d. Now, if we execute this, let's just make sure that this is working. And it is. So you can see over here on the right-hand side that now is a datetime object, and then now too is a string, which is exactly what we wanted. All right, cool. Now let's reach out and touch the United States Federal Reserve API. UFFR API URL, and we'll do requests dot get, and let's make this an F string. If you're not using F strings, you definitely should be. They're the most powerful way to work with strings in Python, as far as I'm concerned. New York Fed /API /rates /unsecured /EFFR /last. Then we need to tell it how many days we would like the API to return. And then we want this in a JSON format. .json. There we go. Now you'll notice that we need to add our days here. And for this exercise, we're going to want it to return 2 days. The 2 days being the previous date and then the date before that. Today's Fed rate is going to equal, pass in this, ref rates, and then we're going to want the 0th instance, or the most recent, and then % rate. Let's execute this real quick so we can see what we're working with here. And that errored out. Oh, because I have a slash there instead of a period. All right, so let's run this really quick to see what response it returns. So the EFFR API URL should return a very raw response. So it's a list of 2 dictionary types. Cool. So within the first element of the list, we can see that it returns all of this data. The effective date, percentile, 1, 25, 75, 99, percent rate, the type, target rate 2, etc. What we're after here is the percent rate. So we need to capture this percent rate, which is 3.08. So the current Fed funds rate is 3.08. And in the next line down, this is how we're capturing that rate. So today's Fed rate, we're passing in the EFFR API URL, the ref rates, the 0th instance of the percent rate. So today's Fed rate is just a straight float, 3.08. Cool. So that's exactly what we are going for there. So now we want to do the same thing, but capture yesterday's rate. Why that's important is because we want to know, eventually, if there's any change day over day in the Fed funds rate. And this is the way that we will do that. So we'll just say yes, Fed rate. So this is going to be the same line of code, essentially, but we have to change one thing here. We want this to be the first instance. If you recall, Python always starts counting at 0, so the 0th instance is our first instance. First instance here effectively becomes our second. I hope that makes sense. So let's build ourselves a little helper function here. For the Fed rate delta over the Fed rate change day over day. We'll say Fed delta equals today's Fed rate minus yesterday's Fed rate. Straightforward. And then we're going to want to round our Fed rate delta to 2 places. Because if we run this right now, the Fed delta is going to be like 32 decimals long, and that's not what we want. So let's return from this function Fed delta. Cool. Finally, let's build a little function, another little helper function that tells us whether the Fed rate is going up or down. That will be useful when we put it into the body of the email message. So I'll show you what I mean here in a second. Fed up or down. If today's Fed rate minus yesterday's Fed rate is greater than 0, then return a string that just says increased by. Else return a string that says decreased by. All right, there we go. Now, let's make a function that sends our email. Sendgrid email. we've already written quite a bit of this code in our first example. So let's pop that in there. And we can use this. So again, we're creating a message object here. Message equals mail. We're putting in our from email, our to email, our subject, and then the body. HTML content is our body. And we're using we're creating a client, passing in our Sendgrid API key, capturing the response that's coming back to us from Sendgrid that lets us know whether it was successful or it failed, and some other elements that we don't really care about. And then we're printing two of those elements that are coming back from Sendgrid, the response.status code and response.body. Now let me call this Sendgrid email. But you'll notice that we are sending an email, but we're not using any of this information yet. So we want to put these functions into this email. So let's change this around a little bit. Let's call the subject Fed funds rate as of now. And we'll need to do now too. If you try to use now, where it's the datetime object, this will fail. This has to be a text string, so which is what we've done here. We took our datetime instance, translated that into a string using strftime. Let's modify our body here. I don't care if this is bold or not, but let's say good afternoon. Good afternoon, if I could type. Then let's do a line break here. The Fed funds rate is, and we'll put in today's Fed rate, translating this into a string. It won't work if it's an integer or a float. This needs to be a string. And let's see, the rate now here's where we use our function that we wrote. Plus, and we want a space between our wording here so as not to smash everything together. And Fed rate up or down. Thanks, Ryan. Now let's test this. Now it looks like I have an error here. Invalid syntax. There we go. And we have another syntax error here. An unmatched close parentheses. There we go. All right, let's send this. Let's see, that failed. Because I'm passing in the wrong function here. So this needs to be Fed rate delta. There we go. Let's try executing this again, and this should work. I have so many parentheses here. All right, let me try this again, and this should work. And there we go. We have an email with the Fed funds rate as of the date. good afternoon. The Fed funds rate is 3.08. The rate decreased by nothing. Thanks, Ryan. We can kind of change this around and tighten up the logic, make it look a little bit cleaner here. Let's see. Put a space here. Make it look a little neater. There we go. All right. Yeah, it looks a little neater. I think if I was going to spend more time on this, I'd obviously fix up the logic here to say if the rate changed by nothing, then the rate stayed flat at 0.0 day over day, as opposed to saying the rate decreased by nothing. But that's the gist. I mean, you get the idea. There was a lot more rates in this at one point, and I'm sure they still use it that way. And then there's a whole lot of logic and analysis that builds on top of this, but that is proprietary to them. So obviously I'm not going to share that here. But this is the gist of it. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Drop any comments, questions, or concerns that you have down below, and I'd be more than happy to answer them. Also, do me a favor, like this video and subscribe to this channel. I would really appreciate it. And I will see you in the next video where we discuss how to send an email with AWS Boto 3 and SES, or Simple Email Service. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.